The Senate Judiciary Committee chamber crackled with tension as Justice Samuel Alito leaned back in his witness chair, that infamous smirk playing across his lips while Jasmine Crockett prepared to question him. The Supreme Court justice had spent 2 hours treating the historic hearing with barely concealed contempt, rolling his eyes at senators, whispering dismissively to his counsel. But when Crockett pulled out her tablet and said, "Justice Alito, I have your wife's text messages," the smirk vanished instantly. The packed gallery held its collective breath as she continued, "Would you like me to read what Martha Ann wrote about your election case's strategy, or would you prefer to answer my questions truthfully?" For the first time in his career, Samuel Alito looked genuinely afraid. The confrontation that would shatter the Supreme Court's carefully maintained mystique began with an unprecedented moment in American history, a sitting Supreme Court justice appearing under congressional subpoena. Samuel Alito, appointed by President Bush in 2006, had shaped American law through increasingly controversial decisions, from overturning Roe v. Wade to expanding gun rights while displaying open disdain for those who questioned his judicial philosophy. His chambers had become synonymous with conservative judicial activism wrapped in the language of originalism. Jasmine Crockett, the youngest member of the House Judiciary Committee to lead Supreme Court ethics reform efforts, represented everything Alito dismissed, a young, black, progressive woman who dared to challenge lifetime-appointed judges. A former public defender who had watched Alito's decisions destroy lives in real courtrooms, she brought prosecutorial precision and an absolute refusal to be intimidated by judicial robes or institutional power. The hearing had been called following explosive revelations about undisclosed luxury trips and financial entanglements between Supreme Court justices and billionaire donors. Alito arrived at the Hart Senate office building treating the entire proceeding as an insult to his dignity. His opening statement dripped with condescension, lecturing senators about separation of powers while suggesting that congressional oversight of the Supreme Court bordered on constitutional violation. He punctuated his remarks with theatrical sighs and visible eye rolls whenever Democratic senators spoke, his body language broadcasting complete contempt for the proceeding. When Senator Whitehouse questioned him about fishing trips to Alaska with billionaire Paul Singer, Alito's response became a masterclass in judicial arrogance. "Senator, personal hospitality from friends requires no disclosure. This has been understood for generations by those who actually comprehend judicial ethics, rather than those who weaponize them for political theater." The atmosphere shifted palpably when Crockett's turn arrived. As a House member invited as special counsel due to her expertise in judicial ethics law, her presence had already irritated Alito, who whispered audibly to his attorney, "Now we're taking questions from junior House members?" His dismissiveness was obvious as he adjusted his glasses with exaggerated movements, barely glancing at Crockett as she arranged her materials. She began with measured calm, asking about specific disclosure requirements under the Ethics in Government Act. Alito responded with barely concealed mockery, explaining judicial disclosure rules as if teaching a first-year law student. Representative Crockett, perhaps someone with actual judicial experience would understand that personal hospitality has a well-established meaning in our ethics framework. These aren't complex concepts for those of us who've actually served on the bench. The insult hung in the air as several senators shifted uncomfortably. But Crockett didn't react with anger or defensiveness. Instead, she pulled out her tablet and began scrolling through documents with practiced efficiency. "Justice Alito, you mentioned personal hospitality. I've reviewed every financial disclosure you filed since 2006. In 2008, you disclosed a fruit basket worth $50 from a law school friend. In 2011, you disclosed concert tickets worth $100 from your brother-in-law. Yet somehow, private jet flights worth $100,000 and yacht trips worth even more don't meet your disclosure threshold." The gallery murmured as Alito's smirk tightened. He launched into a technical explanation about the definition of friend versus acquaintance, suggesting that Crockett lacked the sophistication to understand such distinctions. That's when Crockett revealed her first piece of evidence. "Justice Alito, while you were explaining friendship to me, I obtained something interesting through a whistleblower. Text messages from your wife, Martha Ann Alito, sent during the period when several election cases were pending before the court." The color began draining from Alito's face as she continued. "On November 15, 2023, your wife texted a conservative organizer, quote, 'Sam says the election case arguments need to focus on state legislature authority. That's the winning path with our majority. Would you like to explain how your wife knew your judicial thinking on a pending case?'" Alito's attorney immediately objected, claiming spousal privilege and privacy violations, but Crockett was prepared. Justice Alito himself wrote in Henderson v. United States that privacy claims cannot shield coordinated efforts to influence judicial proceedings. Your own words, Justice. She began reading more messages, each one more damaging than the last. Martha and Alito discussing dinner parties where pending cases were deliberately discussed. Texts about which conservative lawyers should file amicus briefs based on Sam's hints about what would be persuasive. Messages coordinating with religious liberty groups about framing arguments for her husband's consideration. The Senate chamber sat in stunned silence as evidence of judicial impropriety accumulated like avalanche. Alito attempted to regain control, his voice rising as he accused Crockett of conducting a witch hunt, of violating his family's privacy, of not understanding the difference between casual social interactions and improper influence. But Crockett had saved the most devastating revelation for this moment. Justice Alito, let's discuss casual social interactions. On March 3, 2024, at a dinner party at your home, you told major donor Harlan Crow that the court would, quote, find a way to protect religious liberty, even if we have to be creative with standing doctrine. This was 2 weeks before oral arguments in Mitchell v. Department of Education. Your wife texted her sister that night, excited that, quote, Sam finally told Harlan exactly how the religious cases will go. The gallery erupted. Senators from both parties leaned forward in shock. Even Republican senators who had been defending Alito looked uncomfortable. The justice's face had turned from pale to deep red, his hands gripping the witness table as he struggled to formulate a response. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its earlier condescension, replaced by defensive anger. These are fabrications, mischaracterizations. My wife's private communications have been taken completely out of context. This is exactly why the Supreme Court should not be subjected to these partisan inquisitions. But Crockett wasn't finished. She pulled up financial records showing speaking fees Alito's wife had received from organizations with cases before the court, payments that had been routed through shell organizations to avoid disclosure requirements. She presented evidence of Alito participating in strategy calls with conservative legal organizations while their cases were pending. She read emails between his clerks and advocacy groups coordinating legal arguments. Each revelation built upon the last, creating an undeniable pattern of ethical violations that shattered the carefully maintained fiction of judicial independence. The moment that would go viral around the world came when Alito, now desperate and cornered, made his fatal mistake. Rising partially from his seat, his voice dripping with fury and disdain, he pointed at Crockett and declared, "You are a junior congresswoman with no judicial experience, no understanding of Supreme Court jurisprudence, no comprehension of the complexities we face. You couldn't possibly understand the burden of interpreting the Constitution for this nation. This is nothing but a political hit job by someone utterly unqualified to even question a Supreme Court justice." The chamber fell silent. Crockett stood slowly, her movement deliberate and controlled. She looked directly at Alito, then at the senators, then at the packed gallery of citizens who had come to witness this historic confrontation. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of moral clarity that cuts through all pretense and political theater. Justice Alito, you're right. I'm not a judge. I've never worn a robe or had a lifetime appointment. But I understand something you've forgotten. Justice isn't supposed to be for sale. The Constitution isn't supposed to be interpreted based on which billionaire throws the best dinner party. And that oath you took wasn't negotiable based on who was offering the nicest fishing trip. She paused, letting her words resonate through the chamber before continuing. You say I don't understand your burden. I understand it perfectly. Your burden is to be impartial, and you've sold it. Your burden is to be ethical, and you've abandoned it. Your burden is to serve justice, not your donors. I may be junior Justice Alito, but at least when I took my oath of office, it didn't come with a price tag attached. At least when I interpret the law, it's not based on what my husband's golf buddies want to hear. And at least when citizens come before me seeking justice, they don't have to wonder if the other side bought me first. The gallery exploded in applause. People rose to their feet throughout the chamber, their ovation drowning out the chairman's desperate gaveling for order. Senators from both parties stood, some applauding, others simply staring in shock at what they had witnessed. Alito sat frozen in his chair, his mouth slightly open, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. His attorneys huddled around him, whispering urgently, but he seemed unable to hear them, unable to process that a freshman congresswoman had just destroyed his carefully cultivated image of judicial supremacy. The applause continued for nearly 3 minutes, with security officers making no effort to quiet the crowd, some of them visibly moved by what they had witnessed. When order was finally restored, Alito attempted to respond, but his words came out stuttered and weak. He tried to return to technical legal arguments, to procedural objections, but the moral authority in the room had shifted completely. Crockett had transformed the hearing from a procedural exercise into a moment of genuine accountability. Every subsequent question from other senators built on the foundation she had laid. Republican senators who had planned to defend Alito found themselves asking probing questions about the text messages. Democratic senators called for immediate ethics investigations. The chairman announced that the committee would subpoena additional records based on Crockett's revelations. Within minutes of the exchange, clips were spreading across every social media platform. Hashtag Crockett Destroys Alito became the top trending topic globally. News networks interrupted regular programming to air the confrontation in its entirety. Legal scholars called it the most significant moment in Supreme Court oversight history. Even conservative commentators struggled to defend Alito, with several admitting that the evidence Crockett presented was deeply disturbing. The Judicial Conference announced an emergency meeting to discuss ethics enforcement. 3 federal judges publicly called for Alito's recusal from all pending cases mentioned in the text messages. By evening, protests had formed outside the Supreme Court building, with citizens demanding judicial accountability. Law schools across the country organized emergency forums to discuss the implications of Crockett's revelations. The American Bar Association issued a statement calling for comprehensive Supreme Court reform. Several major law firms announced they would no longer argue cases before Alito, citing ethical concerns. The White House, initially cautious about commenting on judicial matters, released a statement supporting congressional oversight of the federal judiciary. Even former Republican-appointed judges began speaking out about the need for enforceable ethics rules. The long-term impact extended far beyond one hearing. Crockett's confrontation became a catalyst for the Supreme Court reform movement that had been building for years. Legislation requiring financial disclosure and recusal rules for Supreme Court justices, previously stalled in committee, suddenly had bipartisan momentum. Law schools began teaching the confrontation as a seminal moment in separation of powers doctrine. Young lawyers, particularly women and people of color, cited Crockett's fearlessness as inspiration for challenging institutional power. The image of her standing calm and composed while Alito crumbled became iconic, printed on protest signs and shared millions of times as a symbol of speaking truth to power.